Thank you very much, Christina, and greetings to you all. Today, as you've heard, we're marking the World Refugee Day 2021 and also the 50th anniversary of the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees. I'm very happy to join Goal and all of you in this event to launch the documentary and exhibition on Goal's work with nomadic and semi-nomadic refugees from Syria now living in Turkey. And the hat that I thought it was most appropriate for me to wear is my hat, in fact, as chair of the elders. There's no better way to value the lives of refugees and create empathy and understanding of the fact that they're people like us than to tell their story and tell it well and tell it in detail and tell it in all its human aspects. And this is, I think, what both the documentary and the exhibition are doing. And it does create empathy. People really understand these are just ordinary people like us, just forced out of circumstances beyond their control to face terrible barriers and have to create new lives for themselves. We need many more stories like those shown on the documentary and exhibition today. And what we need to do is we need to learn to weave these stories, these individual stories, into a different general narrative, a narrative that changes our sense of how we view refugees and migrants, and how we see them as people, how we take a people-centered approach to human migration. The elders feel very strongly about this. We're committed to maintaining the spotlight as much as we can on the plight of refugees and migrants, but also see them in a more positive light. We want to challenge the negative narrative. We want to support multilateral mechanisms and, of course, UNHCR in all its work. And we want to emphasize the benefits to countries of migration. I'm not, in fact, an expert on Turkey and on Turkey's approach to refugees, although I recognize, as has been said, that Turkey is the biggest refugee host nation with about 3.7 million Syrian refugees. But Lakhdar Brahimi, another elder, and myself visited a camp in Jordan just a few short years ago for Syrian refugees. And before we got as far as the camp itself, we became very aware that many Syrians don't go into camps in that country, but are part of villages and stay in people's homes. And of course, their children affect schools. We heard that schools had to have extra classes. There was no doubt that the number of Syrians in Jordan was a burden on the country. But I was very struck when I asked quite a number, 3 or 4 people at different times, what do people in Jordan think about the Syrians who've had to come into the country? And the answer I got was more or less the same from each of the people I asked. And it was a lovely answer. It was, the Syrians are our neighbors. And when they're forced to leave their country, they become our guests. If only this were the global view of refugees, we would be in a much, much better place. It's true that those forced to leave their country through conflict, or sadly increasingly because of the climate crisis, tend to stay as close as possible to home. So they tend to be in countries like Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, if they're Syrian, because they want to return as soon as possible. And the elders have visited other refugee camps, for example, in Ethiopia, which was a camp for South Sudan refugees. Ethiopia has a lot of refugees. Of course, Ethiopia now has the conflict in Tigray, which the elders are also very concerned about. But that's a different story. And we've been to a camp in Sicily to see how Italy was coping with those who cross the Mediterranean. But the truth is, the world is not managing the problem well and hasn't been for a number of years, and it's getting worse. the figures are very alarming. At least 79.5 million people around the world are forced to flee their homes, either because of conflict, because they're driven out by the climate crisis, but that's a very large number. And there are nearly 26 million registered refugees, of whom about half, or maybe slightly over half, are under 18, are children. We're very concerned as elders by the number of climate displaced people already, because they don't, of course, have the status of refugees under the convention. And there's no doubt this number is already increasing and will increase because of the worsening climate impacts, because of the climate crisis. And this number is probably quite disguised by COVID. COVID is giving countries a health reason to close their borders. And European countries have been doing this. COVID is on the way out because of vaccines that are not equitably accessed or distributed. But nonetheless, we are coming out of that crisis. We need to bear in mind that people will probably move more in the short term after that. I was very glad that in January 2020, the UN Human Rights Committee took a stand on this issue. The Human Rights Committee ruled that, and I quote, "Refugees fleeing the effects of the climate crisis cannot be forced to return home by their adoptive countries." That was the important principle established. Actually, as sometimes happens in important cases, the person who takes the case may lose through facts on the ground. The case was taken by a man from Kiribati who applied for protection from deportation from New Zealand, where he was, back to Kiribati, because he claimed that the rising sea level would put his life at risk. And the Human Rights Committee looked at the situation, and I think they found that he could move from the island where he was to another atoll in Kiribati. In other words, he didn't face the imminent risk to his life if he had to go back to Kiribati. So he lost on the facts. But it actually is very important that that principle has been established. I have worked with others, particularly when I had my foundation on climate justice, to try to have more security for climate displaced people. Let me just tell you a story of a friend of mine who works precisely now on moving a number of her people from the island where they are to where they have to go. Ursula Rakova has been working in the Carteret Islands off Papua New Guinea. The island is going under. She works to move about 1,500 people to Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. And just hearing the story of how this comes about, first of all, they had to go and look at buying land, which they have now been able to buy. They had to meet neighbours in small numbers, get to know who their neighbours would be. And now they've really begun to move, and they go by boat quite a distance, but it's the same sovereignty. They're not going to a different country. And when Ursula is describing all of this, she somehow gets sadder and sadder. And at the very end, she says, and there are tears in her eyes when she says this, "But there's nothing we can do about the fact that we have to leave the land of the bones of our ancestors." And you get that sense of an Indigenous people having to leave the land of the bones of their ancestors. But for every refugee who has to leave, there are terrible memories and reasons for having trauma about having to leave. And that too can be brought out in conversation, in listening, in the visits that we've made to the different camps in different countries. The elders have really felt extraordinarily moved by the stories we've heard, and an extraordinary affinity with those we've been talking to. There's been a lot of humour, a lot of warmth, a lot of sense of really valuing the people. I'll tell you, I'll end with Mandela's words, but I'll tell you a funny story of our visit as elders to the camp in Ethiopia. I was with the former president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, and the person who was introducing us said, because she was very proud of it, she said, you know, you've got 2 presidents visiting you at the moment. And there was an elderly lady there, and her response was, in this home, we are all presidents. And it was just the way she combated the idea of we being somehow elite and we being in her home. And I loved it. We all laughed at and that's important. It's important to kind of see the very human side and feel that empathy and that sense of solidarity. That's what we need to feel more. And that's what Mandela tried to capture in a saying that I want to quote of his, because I always like to bring him into the picture as chair of the elders. He said, you can start changing the world for the better daily, no matter how small the action. So that's what all of you involved in this documentary, in this exhibition, in the work that Gold does in Turkey, and the work that you all do to support as human beings in a people-centered way, the importance of changing the whole narrative and valuing refugees and valuing migrants as being precious to all our countries. So I commend you for the work you do, and I'm very happy to have been associated with it. Thank you.